Okay, hi, I'm Nayan Kulkarni. I've been making art in one way or another since the early 1990s. And I guess outside of the kind of media and mediums that I've used, most of the work comes from engagement with a particular place or historical moment. Sometimes that's not completely apparent because it becomes a private internal journey, and other times it's specifically in relation to a place or a building that somebody's asked me to look at. And if there's something I find interesting, then I, generally speaking, I'll start working from an idea of a place. Now, sometimes place might be a single person, dead or alive, might be a person I've met, might be a town square, might be, in one case, it was a ruin outside of St John the Baptist Church in Chester. So it was, that was an invitation to think about a relationship between, they were instrumental in the sense that they wanted it to be, to work with light, which isn't so difficult for me because I work with light a lot. But what becomes interesting is thinking about the place and the people that are invested or vested in that place, and then how one can develop a response and a work that speaks about that place and also contributes to it.
Yeah.
So I guess my practice is characterized by a kind of research interest in a kind of moment in time or place.
Yeah, yeah, great. And was there a particular moment when you were sort of started working in public space, or that initially drew you to that? Was it an invitation, or did it come from you yourself as an artist?
Well, I guess I suppose the first public artwork I made would have been at college in my first year undergraduate, because we got very tiny little studios, and obviously we're first years, so you don't get much space. Some of the first public work I made was actually infiltrating the building, the art school in Birmingham, which was, so I used turmeric and chili powder, and I kind of working, I suppose, after thinking about Richard Serra's lead corner pieces, I kind of started to think about how the building and a kind of gestural sculpture could start to function. But in terms of things outside, that would also be 1991, where I had no permission to, but I made a massive stone sculpture in the Lake District. It was about 70 or 80 meters long. It was a series of processes. I was very interested. I've always been interested in flow, water, and landscape, and that's work I'm still doing, really. Gosh. In that piece, I had a very small canvas bag, which I put into it. I had a spanner and about 100 meters of steel cable, and I made structures across with the performances with my body above water,
yeah,
for photography. So that was uninvited. The first invited piece would have been the year after actually literally as I graduated in 93. Wasn't really invited. Somebody pointed out that there were some opportunities in Snibston Discovery Park.
okay.
Which I didn't get, by the way. I didn't get, but fortunately Janet Curry, who was the East Midlands Arts Officer, saw that I was quite enthusiastic. So for my first opportunity, which was because I was very enthusiastic, so they kind of invented, I think there was another artist, Jez Noon, who also was very enthusiastic. I had no experience. So after the proper commissions, the paid ones, happened, they conjured up a small honorarium for Jez and I to make a piece of work at the Discovery Park.
Okay.
So that involved sleeping on a friend's floor for 6 weeks and learning how to weld as a gold mining engineer. So, and learning how to dig and design a foundation. It was all learning on the job. Well, that was tiny budgets. I mean, at the time, it was enormous because I was on the dole. £1,000 is like, my goodness. But, didn't go very far when so
I mean, do you feel that was quite instrumental for you at that, in terms of that opportunity that they sort of provided for you, or in terms of what you learned through that?
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. It meant that I wasn't a student. It meant that somebody outside of the world said I'm not a student anymore, and which was nice. But also being in Colville for 6 weeks. This is nothing to do with the work I made, because the work I made came from working out on a piece of paper. What being in Colville at that point in the 90s meant that I met loads of people involved in the landscape. So the people I was staying with had set up their own church, which was really interesting. They'd broken away. They were quite evangelical. But their church was basically, it wasn't raining outside. And I met ex-miners in a bar. And obviously the work I was making had nothing to do with those people, but I took away those thoughts about place. I wouldn't have had the confidence to deal with masculine identity directly at that point. Not sure I would now, apart from my own. But so I took away the experience and have been thinking about that kind of on and off episodes.
So that was kind of pretty much the first opportunity you did then in public space, and at that point then, and that kind of led, sort of, did that directly lead on to sort of the next piece, or was it sort of more kind of?
Oh, it's completely random. I mean, for those of you that remember, the early 1990s in Birmingham was pretty tough. So at that period, there was the Bond Gallery that was run, at the time, was run by the late Mick Thacker, Mark Wren, and Mark Wren and Mick Thacker were two kind of artists who were doing quite a lot of stuff in Birmingham. So the seminal moment was seeing the Fine Rats International when I was an undergraduate under Spaghetti Junction, because what that group of artists did was introduce me and maybe 30 or 40,000 other people about a whole process of thinking about your city. I mean, you can look in magazines. I mean, at that time it was magazines, remember? Seeing international projects and getting very excited about photographs and stuff I've got in the 70s in New York or wherever. Or Marion Mert's projects in the early 80s, I guess. But actually seeing that people I knew were helping them build these new ways of thinking about the cities. That was seminal. And up until I left Birmingham, Mark Wren was really important. As much as a provocateur and a challenger as he was a supporter, but he was fantastic.
You think
there's a kind of pragmatism that Wren and Thacker had, which I never have. I've never had that kind of pragmatism. But underpinning their pragmatism to proceeding as an artist in the world were some really, really key things about thinking about the relationship between what a place, who appears to be the custodian or the stakeholder in space, actually is, and where power resides. And interesting, some of their performances, which were non-commissioned, were really, really exciting, and some of their commissions were perhaps more conservative, but they were proceeding as sculptors. So it was a very interesting balance within their practice, both a kind of radical and a kind of conservative approach to making art, but also a counter to the kind of spectacle of the Fine Rats work that Wren had been a key player in at the beginning. So there's all these plays between spectacle, mass audience, tiny audience, inclusivity, urban design, infrastructure design. And of course, at that point, the whole of Birmingham city centre has been transformed. So the accident of doing an undergraduate degree at Birmingham and staying meant that, not that I was involved as a kind of professional, if you like, but seeing how a city is transformed through space. So there was that conflict between the Raymond Mason sculpture and the Tess Jarret floorscape brick painting, if you like, outside of the Convention Centre and Symphony Hall, and knowing that it was a possibility, and I think seeing it being built was really interesting. And also knowing Tess Jarret's work, and then seeing how a particular kind of painting drawing practice then became this profound gesture across on a city size. It was an enormous piece of work. Interesting.
Do you think was back then it was somehow, perhaps, I don't want to say easier, but did you feel as a kind of student who was just graduating at that point, that it was somehow kind of, you were able to kind of be part of those conversations? And whereas now, like, I'm just thinking how students graduating.
I'm not sure part of the conversation.
Well,
It was just happening. But because it was happening in Birmingham, there was also the Public Art Commissions Agency had formed. So people have been very important in my practice, like Evan Larkinson, Sam Wilkinson, and a whole generation of public art curators, if you like, were going through that building in one way or another. I think Hazel Kulkarni I met there as well.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I feel the same. Like,
of course, we love her.
Yeah, because Sam Wilkinson was also, she was very involved with when Bristol was getting Cabot Circus, and that.
Oh yeah. Yes, exactly.
Like, I feel like I kind of did the same. I was just coming out and had started working with situations at that point, and then we had a really interesting relationship there with them, because we sort of did a kind of art, sort of public art and an archaeology kind of program that sort of combined the two, and it was based on that whole site being sort of dug up and transformed.
Well, I think Cabot Circus is super interesting because it's right at the heart of the tension between different kinds of public practices.
Yeah.
In relation to what situations were doing, what was going on in the St Paul's district, and then circus media, circus training.
Yeah.
And then how different kinds of sort of inform, and of course the Arnold Feeney, so this relationship between sort of, I wouldn't call them global capitalism, but it's because it's land security. It's like super English capitalism, but this idea of two sort of FTSE 100 companies rethinking a cultural milieu around sort of retail, and then it's literally surrounded by a whole series of forces which kind of oppose that kind of hegemonic, sometimes demonic sort of adhesions to the city.
Yeah.
But those those tensions are really interesting.
Yeah.
And I actually, at the time I was working in Bristol, I was working on all sides. Okay. And obviously it was very conspicuous what I was doing with land securities, but I was also developing a public art strategy in St Paul's, which did go so well in the end. But interesting, but also making simple observations, looking at the relationship between St Paul's and how the streetscapes are occluding and closing, and being inside is not a place of power, but it's also a place where you can make observations which you can't really talk about for about 10 years. for one reason or another. So.
Yeah. Okay, great.
So your question was to do with I suppose what Birmingham in the 90s gave me access to was as a possibility for practice.
Yeah.
And I think also at that point in the late 80s and early 90s, when you chose to do sculpture, you were given in our first year we were given a chisel and a piece of stone by Keir Smith. I mean, he's a fantastic artist, but so a material practice. And a relation, kind of an interest in land art, and interested in European public monumental sculpture from Mariol, Rodin. You know the traditional story. They were kind of they were placed very specifically in your understanding of practice, because physical material needs a place. As a student, you're already starting to engage. And remember, there were quite a lot less of us at that period in time. Yeah. So even though I'm saying we didn't have very much studio space, we had 8 foot by 8 foot and a floor. Yeah. And in Birmingham, people are still making stuff. So there was Gordon Rogers, who's still practicing, who the super generous man of our year would help me get materials from scrapyards and stuff. All that stuff was still possible. So there was lots of trading, and there was lots of building. The city was being torn down and rebuilt. Yeah. Pride was becoming really interesting at the same time that the Arcadia development, shopping development was happening. Pride was becoming more and more present in the city as a kind of yearly kind of politics, if you like. And so the city was really super interesting. Yeah. And this is after the fatwa on Rushdie, which was also operating in Birmingham. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I've over-answered your question.
No, I think it's really interesting. I think I kind of had a similar experience. I think, you know, Bristol was also going through that kind of particular change. Like I entered that city when the Arnolfini was shut for a year. Going through capital development, Spike Island had its capital development, you know, all this massive change to the city centre. And I think, yeah, I sort of go back now and it feels a very, very different place again. But I think those kind of city changes, and then if you're there as a student at that particular time, I think it has an effect on you actually. So I was gonna ask, which might be slightly difficult because it's how you term success, but in terms of how one commission you feel that was successful, I think in terms of what you've taken from that, and maybe how you then try to sort of take that forward in other commissions perhaps. Success in terms of, I don't know, the kind of response of the audience, or success in terms of how you worked with, you know, partners and kind of commissioners within that process. I'm sort of interested in a, you know, particular work that you think that you know, that was successful for you.
Well, I guess because everything's kind of related. So I'm still doing Golden Hour in Hull, but I was also doing a piece in Chelmsford called Vale, and they're kind of part of the same piece of thinking. Mm-hmm. So there are two completely different parts of the country, and it happens that the success in the practice has been able to think about these two spaces. But in terms of specific projects, I guess the one that comes to mind, because it's one of the more recent pieces I made, was Pilgrim for Selby Abbey, which is a straightforward invitation to stick a great big video image on a building. Now, I've spent a lot of time in my life writing about how horrifying I find that kind of thing. Because, you know, why would you have, you know, a kangaroo jumping around down your local high street, which I have seen very recently. Or, you know, Father Christmas climbing up famous buildings.
Yeah.
What I found, one, there was a couple of reasons why one would do it and why I think it was successful. Was first thing is I trusted both the first person that invited me, and I got to meet the team from the council, the county council, district council. Got to be careful there. Definitely the district council.
Yeah.
And I thought I could work with that group of people. There was they immediately granted a trust.
Yeah.
And kind of social, you know, kind of a human thing. It's like, oh, I trust these people.
Yeah.
And so from there you can say, well, why was it successful? It was successful because whatever happened at the end, it started off in a place of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Where, and successful in other reasons. It opened up new ways of thinking about music in my practice, which is quite good. I got to, well, it's quite good, it's amazing to get that opportunity to think. So, of course, if it had been a traditional method of shortlist through practice, it's now shortlist, which I think is terrifying. Shortlist through practice and then pitch an idea, and we'll choose the one which we're most comfortable with, or the one we think meets our criteria much better. This project was, we like your work, you're going to use video projection.
Yeah.
I'm a video artist, what am I going to say?
Yeah.
How will you do this? Because it's a building in a specific time, it's a 950 years of its anniversary, which is a way of a project happening. It's also kind of interesting. It deals with a site of nearly 1,000 years. Now that's very interesting for me, about an idea of a kind of Englishness growing in a place, and a whole series of myths which I didn't address directly in the work. And also it's Selby, which is former coal mines, where there's a whole set of energy is across the landscape, from coal mines to wind turbines to solar farms to peat, from peat references back, you know, nearly 1,200 years. So it was a place that one could engage with in a kind of open way. One thing there wasn't time for was for me to really talk to anybody other than the people I bumped into.
Okay, so it was very quick turnaround then. Yeah.
Yeah, basically we had the minimum amount of time required piece of
Did
work, because I did a lot of
did that
location filming. And it was still 9 months, but that's really filming all over Yorkshire is not is quite tricky.
Yeah.
Location, and then there's a lot of video footage to edit, and then so and I guess the success was one. It wasn't it did some things with video projection and architecture which were pretty new, both on a technical and sort of semiotic level, I guess. But some of the kind of experiential stuff was new because the projectors hadn't existed until in the UK until actually this date, and I worked with QED to. So on the technical level, I was learning about these new projection technology and rethinking the possibilities of what I'd started to make through what would actually happen on the building, and that was a brilliant opportunity. Yeah. And that opportunity was vested to me through the commissioning structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was responsible for delivering, for hiring. At first I was a bit reluctant, but if we hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had that relationship with the production team, which in turn, there were some reds which you couldn't see or get with most video projection technologies. The reds of these particular, so like 4 months of work trying to get an approximation of a particular resonance in red. And then I find a projector that's producing its own resonance, and you remake the work. So on a phenomenal level, the work doing some stuff which was unprecedented, just because it hadn't been in the country before. But also the opportunity to work backwards from that. So basically working backwards and forwards. So video projection and events are kind of curious because you've got to fix it. It's going to open on this day, and you are on this day. And basically, you can't screw up because there could be between, in our case, 3,000 or 4,000 people waiting for it to turn on, and in other artists' case, there could be 60,000 people.
Yeah, lots of pressure.
Yeah, it's on a technical level.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting. Most of them are only 4 minutes long, 5 to 10 minutes. This piece was nearly 20 minutes long, as I kind of. It's like risk in terms of the audience standing in the rain watching the piece that unfolded over 10 minutes. And it started off as so my compromise was to make it 20 minutes.
Did you, as the artist, because of it being quite stressful in that way, so did you feel kind of supported by the commissioner in that kind of sense? And you talked about trust, they supported you through that process and yeah.
Even the whole way through. So I suppose Hazel Kulkarni was curating the whole festival.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very conspicuous how she's helping, and sometimes it just happens, and you find out 2 years later what was really going down.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the district council were completely trusting, and stuff which lots of people dealing with light will know about was that I really wanted quite a number of street lights to be turned off.
Yeah.
Stuff that wasn't directly following the work, stuff that was in eyesight rather than happens. They closed it. Now, the super thing that happened, which we all know will happen, but it's very difficult to pull off, as soon as they close down the street 2 hours before the artwork is going to turn on, the town transforms. We know this. I mean, the first time I experienced that was Lady Diana's the funeral, the day of Lady Diana's funeral, where my partner and I actually laid down in the middle of the road in Kentish Town, because the whole city transformed. So we know this happened. But when we did the rehearsal, you could actually feel the whole atmospheric engineering, if you like, of Selby change. Okay. People do slow down. People do spend more time looking at other people on the street.
Yeah.
So even if the artwork had been utterly boring and rubbish, the contribution was that we calmed Selby down for these 3 evenings, changed, made it, produced a different relationship between its central building, if you like, its bounding public realm, and these roads, and how people occupied that space, and that's really, really lovely. And that's like it's not an accident, but it's a byproduct of thinking about your town.
Yeah. I was thinking about one of the questions I was going to ask later, which I might ask now because it sort of connects. You said, there wasn't a lot of time within that commission. You had to turn it around very quickly, and you didn't have time to talk to people in a lot of detail. But it sounds like there was a huge then sort of audience for the kind of resulting work. I just wondered, sort of the term engagement is used so much these days, and I just wonder what your thoughts were on that from an artist's perspective, because my worry as a kind of producer is that you kind of it sort of local authorities and commissioners, that kind of the expectations of that and what that means as well is that people have a very particular idea of and I don't believe actually that it's not inherent in every artist's practice either. It's
not even inherent in every work.
No, exactly. But that expectation of when you see briefs that that are kind of put out into and actually and then they don't even allow enough time for that to happen in a kind of proper, meaningful way either. So I just wondered what your how do you deal with that? How within your
it depends on it very much depends on the project and my response to the place. Yeah. So I do find, in fact, mostly I won't even, although I'm quite tempted because some of the sites and places are really interesting, if the brief is over restrictive in relation to engagement, then I really, unless it has to be super exciting place to go through that. But saying that, so let's look at the piece I did in Chester. I can't even pronounce it because it's an Old English. Herrera. There was an expectation that in the brief that there would be some form of social engagement. Well, actually, there were more specific stakeholder consultation.
Okay, yeah.
And for that piece, it was totally appropriate to meet the neighbours.
Mm-hmm.
So the first meeting we did, and this was with Carolyn. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten her surname. It's terrible. I'm so sorry. I think Carolyn Murray. We did our first consultation in the local tea shop, okay, which was really down the steps from where the site was. And I also with Dr. Catherine Clark set up an editorial steering committee for the work because it's a very text-based work.
Okay.
So all of the conversations that we had, formal and informal, were in order to get a better understanding of how the text that Catherine and I were choosing from the archives and from as far back as the 12th century, I think, mm-hmm, how people would respond to some of the key ideas and key themes. And that then guided the way one could construct a work that's essentially about archives and text. So there was a very specific role, and that we formed very specific, in my head at least, there was a very specific limit to that role. It was an editorial advisory board, which meant that one of the editorial advisory boards was about 40 people. So it was a good 4-hour workshop where we were looking at the different phrases from the archives and how they functioned now. Mm-hmm. And so that's like a formal process which actually really did help the work. And you would call it socially engaged in a sense. Mm. I.e. we engaged with people that lived literally next door to the building and sometimes had a pretty strong interest in what happened in the centre of Chester. Yeah. But in a recent work I did in Cheriton, I really wanted to work with a singer. So I developed, and then I was introduced by the local church to Jade, who's a local singer. She's in her late teens. She sings, and her pitch is great. So I met her, did a very quick workshop. I mean, this is her time and her mother's time. Heard the voice and then completely rethought and developed an entire musical and light-based piece from her voice. I was always going to use a particular I guess inspiration from the rose tree, sort of like a kind of pan-European myth or fairy tale. but it was her voice, and then I basically developed the installation from her voice, and she literally sang for me, and I
Yeah.
rewrote the piece. So it's not collaboration in the sense that I didn't develop the thinking for the work with her. It's collaboration in the sense she happened to go to church next to where the artwork was going to be for 2 nights,
Yeah.
and she had to meet me a couple of times to develop the singing. I mean, I'm doing this recording on my knees in meeting rooms, and
Yeah.
so it's very contingent. And what's important about that is anybody in that part of Kent will hear underneath her beautiful voice her local accent.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I found that I couldn't really, I wouldn't have identified the specifics of her accent. But I did identify the specifics of her ability to hear, I see. So, and she was lovely.
Yeah.
And that wasn't even required. The worst kind of public engagement is where you have to do it because it's a condition of a planning discharge.
Yeah.
Which is evidencing an invisible process, which costs money and time, is ultimately cynical. But it's not cynical on behalf of the delivery team or even the local authority. It's cynical in relation to a kind of whole idea of politics and engagement. So in those situations, one is just dragged along the kind of lowbrow idea of how communities can be involved in their public spaces, and you don't have a choice because it's a legal requirement. And obviously somebody's spending quite a great deal of money on something that actually it might have possibilities for social engagement, so you really do
the right way. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But even saying that, you still get to meet some people, but usually far too late in the process.
Yeah, and then kind of in a situation that's been, like you say, has been sort of contrived into, exactly. So,
but when there is no, particularly when you're spending time in place, you will meet people.
Yeah.
And so a lock keeper on one of my filming days opened the lock and closed the lock because he was pumping the weed. He had 5 discharges on each tide. So I got to talk to him. We met him again further upstream because the project was the river from source to sea. And it was a conversation with him that made me think about Tom Jones's Delilah. There was a reference he made, which I then looked up and researched and found that, in fact, the last shift in one of the Selby mines were singing Delilah as they left.
Okay.
So I went to the original musical score, found 2 of the riffs, and then broke those apart, and then so I had the whole section of the work that deals explicitly with this movement from the power station and the wind turbine power station is framed by this kind of memory of a piece of music that Tom Jones's interpretation then informed.
Yeah.
And that conversation, so if there was a second project, it never happens that way. So the engineer that turned off the street lights, I was chatting to him because he was a good guy. And he was asking me about the piece. I mentioned this. I said, "Is this true?" Knowing it was kind of true, but I wasn't certain it was true. And of course, his dad was in the shifts and then we talked about the white knuckle thing and the price, the memory and the price of being a miner as a kind of embodied trace.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the piece that you never get to make in Selby because you've done the piece that's allowed you to then think of the piece.
Yeah.
So then I'll take that somewhere else.
Yeah.
And
kind of.
And there's no way I could have met that engineer until he turned off the street light.
Yeah.
Because he was an interested sort of person that I'm prepared to talk to him about his father. That then started to think how that then produces a new work. So if I work in Yorkshire again, that will then inform the beginning of something else.
Yeah.
But that's engagement with place over time.
Yeah, well, exactly. And over time, I think, is the significant kind of point there as well, I think.
Time.
Yeah, as a whole other, we talk about that for a long time. But I think that's really interesting in the kind of incidental and kind of how everything is sort of joined up in that way and kind of connected as you kind of move from these different places as well in a way. So in sort of contrast to the kind of the success, then I wondered if you could talk about a piece that perhaps didn't go quite to plan from your perspective, and how you how you dealt with that process, and then again in a way how that informs as you go on. Yeah, the kind of learning points for artists who have not encountered working in public space. So.
The first one was a strategic mistake I made on, there was a series of new buildings in the Midlands, public buildings with public space, and one of them, the central building, was a stunning brief and not such an interesting building in the end. It was a stunning brief though. It's a really, really fabulous brief about civicness and how you produce civic buildings.
Okay.
It was because it was the way that these spaces have been contracted to be built, it became quite difficult to figure out how to do particular works. And part of my early work was to look at options. Now my mistake, and I paid the price of the mistake, is I gave 2 options for other spaces, which I didn't really want. I didn't think were that interesting. But part of what I was to do was to kind of sketch out some of the things. And of course, once you said something's a possibility and then they want it, knowing that there was a super exciting thing, I kind of, because the carrot was so fantastic that I did the piece of work that was pretty average. And I kind of regret that because I didn't get to do the thing which was right on my thinking.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, the thing that was right on the edge of my thinking didn't get made, funnily enough. But anyway, at the time, it seemed to be a reasonable risk, but on reflection, I shouldn't have taken that risk because it's an invisibly dull piece of work, which doesn't really make sense on its own. It would have made sense if it made the other thing.
Right.
So the thing only made sense because of that thing. The thing that anchored it didn't get built, so therefore it's kind of playful. It's not horrible, by the way. It's just a bit boring. The other one was much, much worse in respect to, and it's to do with what happened when Labour left, because at the point where Labour lost that election, all the regional development agencies basically were folded. And I was doing a project that came out of a piece of work, a study that they were doing, and we're actually building it. So at that point, there was no institutional support for the artist. Yeah. So I then became contracted to the contractor.
Right.
And they played hardball.
Okay.
And there were 2 pieces of work associated, one which went really well, as it happened, which is a really kind of invisible but rather beautiful sound piece. But then there was something in the hard infrastructure. They beat me down on price. I had to come up with price options. And I didn't have the experience that I could have said no. Didn't have the experience. I was like, hang on a minute, why are you changing this? You can ask the thing, this thing. I'm saying this is how you do it. Anyway, I got bullied gently in the beginning, came up with a second option, which didn't install properly, which then failed, and which they then threatened to sue me over the failure, which basically meant I would have lost my home. Because the insurers, there's nowhere we're support. I mean, I've got professional indemnity insurance, but because it was in the grey area between design and installation, I had done nothing wrong, by the way.
Yeah.
They hadn't done it properly. And that's still, every time I go to that part of the world, I do avoid going to that part of the city because it's kind of fixed, but it is just bad. Yeah. I mean, I went to the extent where I had a slightly older friend, he was a good 15 years older. I asked him to turn up in a suit and say nothing.
Right.
It worked.
Oh, okay.
I was on my own, surrounded by. Within the contracting organisation, there were some really lovely people that were constantly helping me out. But they couldn't. How they were helping me out was, but in terms of the legal situation.
Yeah.
The mistake I made was my documentation wasn't strong.
Okay.
I had everything, by the way. I hadn't lost any document.
Yeah, you could improve that kind of,
Oh no, I could, but it wasn't, it didn't look, it was professionally ordered, but the audit trail, the design risk assessments and all that sort of stuff, there was a design risk assessment and contract risk assessment, but they're all in emails, and I'd never actually consolidate on a weekly report basis. Now, people like Andrew Knight, who's a very, very experienced public curator, he writes file memos.
Right.
All the time. There's always a contract reporting. So what I've learned from that is never work without somebody like Andrew or Hazel or Sam or you or
doing all that stuff. Yeah.
But one of the problems with building that person into your team is they're much better positioned in relation, not between you, but as a triangulation between you and the place, or you and the client.
Yeah.
Because the power of that role is to also audit and check you. And when they're in your team and on your payroll, it's slightly different. The power dynamic's different. Yeah. So I'm much less intact to the project.
Yeah. I think that's really hard though for kind of artists who are starting out there, because obviously that knowledge is kind of accrued, and also, you know, it also is sort of comes down to kind of the situation of the project itself and budget, which quite often isn't necessarily there. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, other than you don't want people to have those experiences in order to learn that in a way, but I don't know, other than
the minute you start practicing, and as budget, I recommend spending £145 and joining the Federation of Small Businesses, because I probably, during that fiasco with the contracts and the failure, I must have had 12 or 13 hours of legal advice on the phone.
Yes.
Mind you, and they did what they were supposed to do, find out who was liable and give me advice. The advice was, it's not your fault. And it's like, well, I have to deal with these people, and there's a city that's looking at me. And if I want to work again, this has to work. Yeah. In the end, the legal stuff doesn't matter. It's not my fault, but I'll never get to work again.
It's your reputation, isn't it? And your profile and that, exactly. That stuff. Yeah.
The Federation of Small Business were just great. You know, it was over the period that an advisor would ring up, and even if nothing concrete came out of the conversation, there was a sense that there were lots of other people who might be plumbers or whatever who were having similar problems.
Yeah.
And it was a way of just measuring it.
Getting that advice and feeling you've got some support from somewhere. Yeah.
So I'm much more careful since that. If I have anything to do with the contract, it's very, very, very clear.
Yeah.
Because things will always go wrong. I mean, I've got a program that's crashing on a project at the moment. I haven't quite identified what's causing it to crash periodically.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely clear in the contract.
Okay.
That's part of the process. You know, it's a complicated digital artwork with live stream cameras, and we're narrowing it down. Now, the weakness, and there's a weakness in lots of my projects, is that although it's explicit that if you want this kind of, if I'm making this kind of work with you, you will give me this particular kind of network connection. Okay. I never get it.
Right. Okay.
No matter how long I try. I don't get why I asked. For example, I'm only the video installation, which is permanent. I was ready to go to the troubleshooting 18 months ago. That's how long it's taken to get the right network connection.
Yeah.
That's stable enough for me to do my work.
And is this kind of, is this kind of a piece that you've recently done? I'm thinking, if there's these problems that occur, do you ensure that you build in a kind of fee for yourself to kind of go back and fix these issues? And
that was Francis Lord was the consultant in the triangulation on that one. No, it's very clear. What I had to make a guess, which is a risk. I guess that there'd be about 6 or 7 days of needing to go to sites.
Yeah.
Once I'd installed it, and it was very, very clear. So there was the artwork. I mean, it's very simple artwork, really. There's this big video wall, like advertising boarding. It's kind of riff on advertising boarding and surveillance, turning it into a kind of cinematic space. So that is a straightforward thing. A builder can put that in, not my problem, because that's just a video wall.
Yeah.
The bit that's really special is the computer and the control of the cameras. That's my artwork. So that I delivered. Basically, that's a rack. So I deliver the rack, and I'm responsible for the rack. They deliver the cameras and the screen. So they fail. That's a warranty thing. That's to do with. So I'm very, very clear that I'm responsible that the video stream in and the video stream out works. But I can only monitor that if they give me the ability to look at it, because I'm not driving to this place every time there's a small bug. Since I've got a stable commitment, which is in the contract but never really understood, I'm monitoring it. So I started that piece in 2016.
Okay.
2020, I nearly finished it.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's 4 cameras and a television. Anyway, no, it's a bit more than that. It's quite complex, but
yeah. No, I think that's really interesting for people to kind of understand and kind of keep those kind of things in mind as well, especially when they're starting out.
Well, one of the things I've built into how much my studio costs is a modem, a kind of a SIM modem thing with a fixed IP address, which is quite expensive. It's about £50 a month. I really, really don't like the fact that's quite a lot of money, I think, for something I might not use.
Yeah.
But it's like a get out of jail card. I just go and stick it onto an artwork. If they haven't given me the connection, at least I don't have to keep driving around the country.
Yeah.
And what I've decided is, okay, well, as soon as this artwork's got its stable connection, I can move it to the next. I know I'm not going to get it. So in terms of planning, in terms of digital artworks, hire somebody to monitor.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting though. I know the camera screens need cleaning. They've got this really, really swanky artwork. Well, it's not that swanky, but they've got this really big, conspicuous digital artwork, which shows the dirt on their windows, the dirt on their cameras. So I can now say, you need to clean the glass. You need to clean your windows. They're really dirty. You've got a really big image of dirt.
Again, kind of issue of maintenance there, which another kind of key point with sort of requiring permanent works and things, and obviously then the issue there is obviously they then don't have the ability to kind of maintain the work, do they? So I think
usually it's really trivial.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get done. In fact, outside of my practice, I have built some stuff for some other designers, and that's really dangerous legally, because you're not responsible for the aesthetics and you have no idea whether they're going to look after it.
Yeah.
And usually there's a fault with something, I mean, a tiny fault, like a piece of 12 pieces of rubber, which costs £5 each, could fail because somebody's over tightened something, and you could be liable for £50,000. If you're not on site inspecting, I mean, whatever you do, whether it's a performance or whatever, you have to build into your thinking that I need to see it for myself. On every level. Because if the audience has turned up and you don't know that the phono cables are shorting, whether it's somebody else's fault or not, you're the one on stage. I've seen them so much. Amazing how often this laptop is used to save other artists' work over the last 20 years.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, that's something else.
No,
it's 4 or 5 times, but they were pretty fraught.
No, I think that's really good points, I think. So I wanted to ask you about the piece that you made for Hull, the blade, and kind of the process of that. And I think mainly in the context of, I said before, about Southampton sort of entering into this potential realm of city of culture, whether it happens or not, there's a process there that the city will sort of go through. And I know that you obviously you're not an artist based there locally, so it's sort of different. But I think it was just interesting to kind of hear from that.
There's a nuance. Let's start with the nuance on local artists. I've been working in Hull since 2004, and
you actually. Okay, so then from a local artist, then so it would be interesting to hear that.
It's kind of important. Blade happened because I was making a birdsong piece. Sounds. Or did it happen because I was doing something for the Academy School? can't remember the timing.
You were already working there.
I was doing one or two of the projects. I'd met a couple of people from the city for a drink after work, and the news was that Siemens had signed the contract. It was just about to go public. It had just gone public at that point. Siemens had signed the deal to start building turbine blades in Hull. This is before City of Culture, or about the same time. I can't remember. But before it had been concerned. So and the conversation I had with the arts officer is, well, what does that mean? Because this is a significant transformation to the way the cities, the Greenport strategies, and how it structures the city around kind of new technology and what those possibilities were for artists. So it was implanted with Siemens. So the City of Culture. So one thing that it seemed to me when Hull decided to go for it, it seemed to me that nobody else had a chance, because the city itself seems to be, it's like, well, it's almost like this is the perfect city to do this.
Yeah.
And their approach was brilliant. I mean, it did all the right uplifting things. Even their promotional video, it kind of coached some of its kind of political critique, but it was all there if you look for it. They didn't hide anything. They just didn't underline it with a great big marker. So there's this kind of like super diverse images, which I think they overplayed later on in the process, but at the beginning it was just like these people in Hull.
Yeah.
So, but of course, the relationship between a Blade, City of Culture, and that meeting in the bar was the first meetings were, so Hazel and Andrew were the curators for the Look Up program.
Yeah.
I've been involved in a conversation with those two professionals for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
And we were doing Illuminate York 2015. I was doing a series of kind of smaller works, and we were just talking about what that means. They were either they'd just got or they're applying to become curators of part of the outdoor program.
Yeah.
And it grew from a conversation. It's a hell of a punt, and it as a process kind of exemplifies, I guess, what's interesting about bringing. I mean, there was quite a lot of criticism again. It's still quite contentious bringing in a completely independent production team, and how they become embedded in the whole, and then how they have their own visions and how the programming works over a year, and then how an argument for a piece of work that wasn't on a program then becomes a commission. So it would start off as a conversation, became a kind of punt to Sam Hunt, who then turned it into a pitch, which then gets challenged. So basically a conversation turns into a punt, which turns into another conversation, which turns into a formal pitch. And all of those things happen.
A very similar way to how Noah Island happened at Situations. It was a conversation between Alex and Claire, and then it turned into a pitch for the Culture Olympiad, and then very similar.
But he didn't seek to answer anybody's brief. It was there was a outside of the sort of like, I think the conversation could have been Hazel and Andrew said, what springs to mind when we say made in a Hull? It grew from there. But it also came from lots of other concerns. I mean, it wasn't. But it's also important to remember that I was involved in the vision documents for the new public realm improvements in Hull, which means I had an intimate understanding of the streetscape. All of those things, unrelated projects. I knew it fitted. I knew where I put it. They just didn't know I knew where I put it. But it was a very honest process. There's no kind of sleight of hand.
No, and like you said, you've been working there for years and understood the context and the city, and and
it got taken over very quickly. So it's a very risky project. Not in terms of it it's kind of drama or it's kind of top level set of meanings, but
it has very massive similar relationships to Noah Island. I think I spent that whole year doing that project just literally on the edge of my seat. You know,
I can imagine.
You know, the idea that this could actually sink in the middle of Poole Harbour and sort of cut off all international shipping into that, you know, just terrifying, you know. But I don't know, I just sort of think you kind of have to hold on to your, you know, seat of your pants, because actually through those types of works, you know, there's something remarkable kind of happens. You know, I think if you can kind of deliver that, actually.
But it's all about teams, isn't it?
Yeah.
Basically, everybody's worrying,
yes.
but they're all worrying about specific things.
Yeah.
I don't worry about the fact that we didn't, in the end, have enough money for enough physical weight, so they put some horrible. We had to come up with a way of stopping people climbing on it.
Right.
The original, we just didn't. You know, too late. It was too late. I mean, I cried over that.
Yeah.
You spend 6 months trying to make a really elegant clamp because you know it's crucial, and then in the end has to be covered up.
Yeah.
And that gives room for people like Jonathan Glancy to get mealy mouth. And you could see it. The minute I saw that going up, I thought that is going to be the target for that kind of person. Turned out to be. They weren't particularly wrong about the aesthetic cues it was sending out, by the way.
I think that's there's a misunderstanding of the nuances and the kind of, as you say, the massive risk, and then the team of people that sort of sits behind a project like that, you know, I kind of misunderstand, you know, totally not understanding kind of what's happening behind the scenes there. And as you say, as the artist, you know, you're sort of like, you know that, and it gets to a point sometimes where it's unavoidable. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was one of the funniest things I saw on that was that we had to come up with a back, you know, an off-the-shelf, behind-the-scenes solution to people walking into this object. And the first arrangement to set defence measures, i.e. benches, people were falling over there because they were looking at the object. And the second thing was they weren't benches. We had somebody they do not sit on this. So, oh my God. It wasn't funny, by the way, but it reflects these kind of things. And of course, people were just walking into it anyway because it was quite a tricksy. I mean, it's extraordinary that it's people into it, even though they were looking at the thing they walked into. It was, but nobody's getting litigious, nobody's running at it. But it had security. So the whole series of phenomena, it was to do with it wasn't an accident you couldn't see the edge. I worked with the engineer to find the angle where it started to do certain things without wobbling around madly. You know, it was pointing hard, and there were bits behind Queen. It was an interesting thing. So. But it did constitute a kind of moment for the city, which I was quite pleased by. I mean, I was pleased by how it. I mean, it's a very old. You know, is it art? Is it engineering? Whatever. I don't really, that's not such
those conversations.
But I never expected to make a piece of work that people would come and touch. Not that I made anything, of course. I just stuck it in the centre, and I didn't do anything. I just worried. I basically fretted for months.
So it was the reception from people, you know, overall kind of, were there difficult conversations to have with people once it was in place there? How long was it there for?
9 weeks, I think. Okay. The Poppy piece by it got removed so the Poppy piece could have its moment,
right?
Which was fine. Which is I was disappointed because although the first iterations of the Poppy installation was pretty powerful, I couldn't see how it's specific to whole inner city culture. It's a generic thing. And there is a place for that, but I think when that, and it wasn't to do with Andrew and Hazel. I think because Andrew and Hazel had produced such a varied program, it just seemed a shame that the city couldn't quite coordinate. So the language of outdoor arts, if you like, non-gallery arts, had a kind of consistency of vision. So it's not a bad piece of work. Don't get me wrong. It's not a critique of the poppies. It's more to do with the voices those curators were trying to propagate in the city, and it's only if they're given the ability to make those voices propagate that you can challenge or enjoy or engage with it, because at least it's clear there are these 12 artists, there are these 12 installations, and all very different.
Yeah. I just
that is really a friend of mine who works in some blue chip galleries made a really, really interesting observation a couple of weeks ago, is that they can't do the international shows. What do they call them? Freeze can't happen. Very, very expensive for galleries. Freeze, very, very expensive. And if you find that this year the actually sales weren't damaged by not doing Freeze Art Fair or wherever Berlin Art Fair, then it changes the way that those galleries might think about their relationship to the fair. I thought that was very interesting. So the international commercial market is transforming in the way that social situations like the one we're having now are transforming, which is kind of interesting. The super exciting thing is, how do we rethink 50, 100, 2,000 of years of thinking about urbanism? I mean, it goes back to, I think, Huvia Kane talked, he made this observation about the town square has been a place of execution and punishment. Obviously, that's where you got hung, that's the law, there's God, and there's the king, how that structured a set of power relation. But the point he was making, that the transition point that I took from it anyway, the transitional point, the thing that's transitory, is the structure of death that moves in and out. The gallows are in and then out of the centre of the public space, which are then arranged along the cardinal axes of the built infrastructure. And we're now, I guess, part of what's happened to my high street, the centre of London, public space, is that it's a narrow architecture, an architecture of death now. But only for a while. It kind of always has been. I mean, if you've been living in Afghanistan for the last 200 years, external space has always been deadly from external aggressors, and most lately the drone. So the drone politics, the idea of a force that will just kill you. You might be innocent, you might not be, but the evidence disappears, is also somehow a way that might help us think through. I'm not saying it's the same. I'm saying the politics of surveillance, the politics of the Membe's necropolitics, can help us start to understand what a kind of civility might be in urbanism and how it completely transforms urbanism. So it perhaps opens up opportunities for artists that just haven't been interested. I think it's a super interesting time for all sorts of practice to involve in a debate. The physical manifestation of space, on the other hand, is more problematic. But it also starts to, the piece of work that's not in a gallery for the one has always interested me. So the speaker in the woodland, well, the sound source in the woodland, which can only be heard by one person randomly, is a kind of piece of that starts to have more currency, perhaps, or more possibility. This is not for a massive crowd. This is for time. And the idea of semi-permanent is a decade where the work is engaged with by one person a week. Over an entire landscape becomes much more possible as a way of engaging in place and time art. So that also opens up a whole other set of practices. But what really worries me is that I'm going to try and do this now. This format then becomes the dominant medium through which artists communicate. Not necessarily a problem,
but it worries me greatly as well, because as although I'm using this as a tool to continue my practice and my work, because there isn't an alternative really, but I, as a producer, curator, I have not actually been very engaged as a kind of audience member to all the programs that have suddenly gone into a digital world. I found that really hard, actually, trying to kind of maintain in contact with your family and friends, trying to continue your work, and then somehow still maintain your kind of your own learning through that digital world as well. My reaction is to go outside. You know, my garden has been, you know, the thing that I want to engage with, the kind of the park at the bottom, at the exploration of the place on my doorstep, that I've found places I never known exist before. That's what's attracted me during this. And it's a very particular time. It might not be so intense as we kind of start to move out of this kind of period, but I find it very troubling, especially when you then have, you know, your key funders like the Arts Council sort of really encouraging in that way of engaging, in that way of programming as well. And
they're very quick though. That's the bit that surprised me. It was like, can you please reflect upon how you're feeling about the current political and biological situation of the planet and how that might reflect on your practice? Like, good grief! Any space reflection?
Yeah. The quickness, the kind of right. We have to. It's like, can we actually not stop and actually, for once, with all of this time again? Like, because I'm not in any kind of space, and I don't think a lot of the, you know, the artists that I'm friends with and work alongside are in any kind of state to kind of process this properly yet. And yet, with then artists are being asked to justify themselves in this particular way when they're in a kind of situation of actually worrying about their own livelihoods and their family.
I mean, it's very, they say, you know, it's where we're all in common. It's like, what on earth am I going to be doing in the time? What do I need to sell? What can't I sell? What do I actually need to make work? People. Place. I couldn't. This is a bit toilet, but there was a beautiful little opportunity which fed directly into some work I'm doing. And the reason why I couldn't apply for it was enough money to get to the place and back, basically.
Right.
But I couldn't. My wrist meant that I couldn't figure out how to go to the toilet safely, so I couldn't apply. Because even if I'd got it, I was a picture of contagion. You burrow down a bit into that. There's a couple of things which immediately interesting about Neville Gibby's project in the residential tower in Liverpool years ago.
Which was it? Sorry?
Neville Gibby's, they did a kind of curated project in a town in Liverpool. Can't remember what it's called now.
Yes.
Really, I think that was a seminal project. It was an amazing project. But it's the idea where housing policy for the Greater London Authority, GLA housing policy in the 70s, its effects are now, and it's not because of the kind of ideology or even the pragmatic politics of that kind of housing, those housing developments with the London Corporation, etc. It's how they're playing out now because of 20 years of assumptions and exploitations and putting under the carpet a whole series of issues. I think Corbyn would call them issues that we need to discuss, and how they become magnified now, and that then becomes another that means another set of another constituency of practitioners and thinkers will because it's in the air, speaking of it becomes more possible, which is interesting. Victoria Park was shut down very, very early. Now, I did a kind of residency at Mare Street Hostel in 2000, where I worked with people with drugs dependency problems that had lost their homes and were in the moment between possibly finding a temporary flat. So they were in a hostel. Now, the only way to engage safely with that community was to go on walks with them with cameras. Very straightforward, art school method, and everybody has a focus, and that's to record their environment. So it's urban design, art school, sort of socially engaged practice method. When you produce a book of walks. Victoria Park is where we spent most of the time, because this is where they spent most of the time. And the first thing that gets shut down was people like that who have dependency issues, have behavioural problems, do not listen to rules, are suddenly excluded from the only place where they can go. That is just amazing, isn't it? Of course they're going to behave badly because they're not being, because society is not engaging, hasn't 20, my experience 20 years, but it's forever. magnifies that problem. So the shutting of Victoria Park gates is significant. For me, it's as significant as chucking a slaver into a river. The shutting of those gates is not is something they should celebrate every evening, like they do on the border between Pakistan and India. The closing of the border. You know, this parade. It's like it's an act of violence of a kind. I think that decision makers and risk assessors probably aren't so tuned to the symbolic weight of the shutting of the gate. And it's too far away. I mean, I should have gone, but I've been breaking the rules. It's a long
time. I think you're. I can. That's what my hope is that this just brings forward, you know, that different voices and more voices, and that we can start looking at things in a much more different way than in perhaps more hope to be able to do that than there has been before, really.
But what I'm looking forward to seeing is the more reflective cultural urban design theory and
kind of holistic view.
Around about a year's time where people have had a time to reflect and actually say, well, what did I learn? Not what am I in the process of learning? And then there's going to be some super interesting, probably disembodied conferences on how you like walking cities is one kind of project, Walkative, another project, which is kind of a series of publications, and how one's imagination, urban imagination, ostensibly has transformed. But I recall walking in Northumberland at the point at which the cow, what was it called? We had to kill.
Mad cow. No.
It was when they had to basically destroy 90%. The whole landscape was infected.
The foot and mouth disease for the.
That's all. Foot and mouth disease. So Northumberland, right across to Cumbria, had become places of infection, and you were the vector of contagion. So the person in the landscape who wasn't paying attention to particular. Now the landscape was shut down a lot, and I think Mark Pinder, amongst other photographers, did some pretty amazing photographs at the time. And so public space, as it were, or landscape, depending on where you are, transformed temporarily, but the residual memory of those pyres probably didn't seep into the British or the UK consciousness in the way it probably should have done. And that's to do with proximity. And of course, it wasn't human beings that were dying.
No.
Although life lost and people have died, obviously. So, and then I recall. So I've got lots of friends in Cumbria. So this concern about Chernobyl reinfecting Cumbria this spring.
Right.
So landscapes of infection, cities of infection starts to become something really interesting. So because you just do it invisibly. So for example, what is a week? What is a week for this kind of artist? This week is when I can be bothered every week is Monday morning and do your accounts. And Tuesday morning, do your accounts. And Wednesday morning, do your accounts. So there's a meeting. I don't do it every day, but
you're regularly on top of that aspect of it.
The administration of a studio, whether it's my first one was the dining table. The administration of that space means for me is really, really important. I'm pretty chaotic and random in pretty much everything I do, but that administration and however boring the contracts are, read every bloody line. Every line. Because lots of them are cut and pastes of good practice, but sometimes they don't make sense, and sometimes this could be a £500 project. This could just be a couple of days, a day's rate and some material budgets. And if the contract doesn't say what you're going to do, you're not having it's respect between people.
Yeah.
And if it's a good contract, you very rarely refer to it again.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you get what you've agreed to because it's like 7 years ago. I did it. We changed that a bit.
Yeah.
Because contracts can be changed, but they can't be kind of backdated. So the contract is really important. And if you're new to the industry, because it's not really an industry, if you're new to the sector, it's not really a sector, but if you're new to have a contract in your hand, when you've got your 10th contract in your hand, you'll see that it's pretty much like the first one, and then you go, I wonder who wrote that, and it's part of the IXIA archive.
Yeah.
These early contracts were written by very few individuals in the UK, probably 10 of them, and other people that they worked with also knew. So maybe 30 people in the UK in the 80s figuring out what an artist's contract should look like.
Yeah.
And I was talking to some artists I know who are of the earlier generation, a younger generation than me. They're not getting very old, and they are now picking up on being expected to have an idea. If you have an interesting idea, so somebody might be interested in working with you. I really find that difficult, and I think because it kind of implies they haven't really looked at your work, or they want something very specific.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of time, and it's always going to be, unless you've got a private income, how do you invest that time? I mean, I could be writing something, doing some video, I could take some video, I can do that. I'm prepared to invest my time in that, but why would I invest time in you if you're not investing that little bit of time in me?
Yeah.
And that speculative idea stuff does sometimes lead to great works, by the way, obviously, life's life.
Yeah.
But in terms of life and practice, it's dangerous because I think the power is not equal.
Yeah.
It's not as far as some people go as far as unpaid work. I'm not sure about that. I'm simpler than that. I just think it's a bit impolite. Look at my work, and if you chat.
Yeah, and I think also it's about being really honest, isn't it? I mean, if it's I think artists should certainly be that kind of. We often need to do 2-stage contracts, and where you're paying the artist for that kind of research and sort of early point of work, because there were a couple of occasions where that didn't work out for lots of different reasons. But you're wanting to kind of cover that artist's time and make sure that they're that is valued in that way before it goes any further, especially if you haven't got the confirmed funding to go further on something. So I think that is really important. Yeah.
I think it was in Hamilton Bailey, sort of public, shared space design guru from the 90s. He made a really a point that I took to heart, but I didn't have the confidence for some time to actually do, because he was challenged about his fee, his design studio fee being quite high. He was quite an expensive geezer. I suppose gurus are, aren't they? But he said, but your fee's also paying for my research time, and I'm not with the university.
Yeah.
This is it. Yeah. There isn't an invisible institution that's paying for my.
Exactly. I think.
So I built into. I've built into my thinking about my practice that it's not the project, it's the practice.
Yeah.
It's the research, the general research, the general playing, the kind of random acts that have to be built into the way you think about your fee.
Yeah.
It's not piecework. Sometimes it feels like piecework, but it's not piecework. It took me a very long time to start realizing that I needed to spend 7 months learning how the chord of D worked to make a really, really bad performance for video. And that had to be built into the way I thought about projects.
Yeah, and the way you can create your practice. No, I had an interesting conversation with an artist about that myself in relation to my practice in a way, being an independent, and he sort of said, well, I set myself up as a business, from a freelancer to a business, with the very kind of, to really change my thinking about rather than seeing it project by project and getting really annoyed at one project because I wasn't being paid properly for that, he said by turning myself into a kind of business structure, it was like, well, I'm then being paid by the business. And so everything was then contributing to that, rather than it being all these sets of individual projects. And sort of seeing it kind of more,
similar things.
yeah, exactly. Which I thought was, yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
And also it means that you're there's a kind of the last really big light work I made, which is really, I mean, large as in physically enormous. I wouldn't have made if I wasn't a limited company. There's no way, because there's a kind of management structure which is implied. It's not necessarily true.
You can still be the single person behind that, but they, they don't know that. It's the kind of how you present yourself, isn't it? Which
there's an administrative, you have to by law have an administrative process, which means that they can, because in the end, when you're building ambitious technical infrastructures for artworks, there's a very significant sum of money that is handed over from one party to another.
Yeah.
And there does need, this doesn't happen very often, by the way, but when it does happen, there needs to be a reassure.
Yeah, you can manage that, and
that's where control is. And for some of the works which look kind of easy, it's because I have absolute control over the image.
Yeah.
And I don't get control over the images if I'm subcontracting the technical elements. Other bits I'll subcontract, or say, can you do that, please? But for some works, so the way you think about studio and practice does change with that. He's right. He's really right.
Yeah.
Also means you can take a day off, and taking a day off means doing a performance of video with a mate. So
yeah, you can kind of you think you have a different way of looking at it. No, that's great. I think. Thank you. It was really helpful.
You're over here, physically over there, but I have the camera that's because my screen cameras. I might have been looking all over.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
I'm looking directly at you from there.
Yeah, I'm sort of. Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Hi. No, that was really helpful. Thank you.